GeoTrekkers, this is Dr. Hal. Welcome to the GeoTrek podcast. This is episode number 77, titled Extreme Weather and Aviation with Jonathan Frank. Y'all are going to love this. Jonathan Frank is a very accomplished pilot. He's a Boeing 777 captain and also an accomplished artist. We're going to travel the world with him from the tropical Pacific to the Arctic to the mountains. We're going to talk about the impacts of volcanoes on aviation. It's going to be a really exciting episode if you're an adventurer, an explorer, if you like flying, if you like aviation, or just learning more about the world around us. You're going to really love this episode. If you're new to the podcast, GeoTrek explores the world looking for stories that are not covered by the mainstream media. We investigate the physical processes behind extreme weather and natural disasters, their impacts on society, and what we can do to get out ahead of these events to make them really less impactful and make ourselves more resilient. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation with Jonathan Frank. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
You bet, Hal. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I see you're coming all the way from Galveston, Texas today, where I am also. So we're across town from each other, but here we are recording on the video.
Outstanding.
Hey, Jonathan, was really excited to talk to you. I mean, you're a pilot, you're fascinated with aviation. You also are an expert in art. We're going to have a really interesting conversation today, but I wanted to start with aviation. How did you become so interested in aviation?
Well, I had the privilege of growing up in the 1960s and 70s when the space race was going on and everything was about aviation or about space. And all us little kids are out there running around with our little Estes rockets or balsa wood airplanes and things like that. And, that was just, part of the deal when we were growing up. My uncle was actually a Navy pilot. He flew P-3s and then flew for TWA. And my grandfather was actually a pilot in World War I with the 43rd Aero Squadron, and he was based in France. So it kind of runs in our family a little bit.
Oh, yeah. I bet you've heard some fascinating stories from other family members from all these different places and times where they were flying. For
sure. And it's been quite an inspiration. And then, being a flight instructor, I get to pass that on to others as well. So, it's a wonderful lifestyle, great career.
No, that's fantastic. I grew up right off the flight path for ABE International Airport in Eastern Pennsylvania. I know You're from Pennsylvania originally too. So I think when you're a kid, sometimes aviation just captures your imagination, right?
Oh, for sure. You sit there at the end of the runway and just watch airplanes take off and land all day. And, it's like, I wish I could do that someday. I bet I could do that. Those lucky guys in that airplane. So,
and here you are living the dream, right?
Absolutely. That's what it's all about.
Jonathan, it looks like, so you gained a lot of your early flying experience in the Intermountain West. You were saying you graduated from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Prescott, Arizona. Right. And then you were working with Rocky Mountain Airways out of Denver for your first commercial airline job. What was it like learning so much flight experience out there in the mountainous areas of the West?
Yeah, it's very challenging, I would say, a lot more different than it would be down here in Galveston or even in the Northeast. The mountains play a huge role in the weather there, and then what we're able to fly and what we can fly, what we can't, where we can go, where we can't go. Of course, density altitude is one of the biggest threats to small airplanes and large airplanes. As the temperature rises and at those higher altitude, the air is less dense, wings develop less lift, and engines develop less power. So you're always dealing with that in those mountain areas. One of the things.
Would you notice that even if you're taking off from Denver, for example, would you feel a difference in the density of the air compared to Houston?
Yes, of course. Even in the 777, we have performance data that is specifically for Denver or for those hot altitude airports. And yeah, we use more thrust. We use longer runways. We use everything. The climb out profiles are different. Everything is a little bit different than it would be down here at sea level. You're basically flying on a small airplane. You're flying on 3/4 to half power when you're flying out of Denver. Jet engines are a little bit better. They got a little bit more performance. And of course, the bigger airplanes have a lot more lift capability and flaps and slats and things. So it gives us more lift to get off the ground. But it still does take a lot of energy and a lot of real estate to get off the ground up in those altitudes.
Well, let's say there's a wind blowing into a mountain range and they're getting an upslope. How high does that effect reach in the atmosphere? Like if you're flying at 25, 35,000 feet, can you feel that effect sometimes?
Oh, of course you can. And the other thing is that you see sometimes over the front range, standing lenticular altocumulus clouds, those lens clouds. And those are the high winds aloft that are coming over the front range, and they can actually overpower the aircraft. So there's times when you are on the backside of that and you're going to full throttle, but you're still sinking. And so that's one of the things as a commercial, in the commercial airline realm, that we really are concerned about is avoiding those standing lenticular clouds and that airstream. Sometimes it's avoidable, sometimes it's not. And then dealing with it with the aircraft performance that you have.
I lived in Boulder, Colorado for a year, and we get a lot of those downslope Chinook winds with those lenticulars,
sure.
and it's beautiful, but I could see the concern for aviation.
Yeah, a lot of times they come down and you witness them rolling down the hills, down the front range and off into the prairie. And unfortunately, that's kind of where they built the new Denver airport, was on the prairie, right where those things tend to dissipate and tend to locate. So yeah, we're always keeping an eye out for that, and especially with general aviation. The larger jets have more power, more capabilities, but man, small airplanes out at the front range, you're always one eye on the weather and what are the winds aloft doing, what are the temperatures doing, what are your dew points doing, all that kind of. You're always kind of looking at that, and so for safety of flight.
Yeah, for sure. It seems like, would it be accurate to say sometimes it's a more complex flying environment than, say, if you're flying into Memphis or something like that?
Oh yeah, definitely. Now Memphis has its own, in the south here has its own, characteristics, such as the thunderstorms. And these thunderstorms down south can be massive, and they can go in a line, as you know, from Brownsville all the way up to Chicago, where in the mountainous areas and the more arid areas, they're massive thunderstorms, but we can generally fly around them.
They tend to be more cellular, right? You'll get like a supercell or a cell that you can kind of go around, right?
Yeah, and sometimes it takes 100, 150 miles to go around the thing, but they are spectacular from the air. They're beautiful, but you don't want to be anywhere near them.
Jonathan, I'm really excited to kind of travel the world with you. You've been like everywhere, with your profession and just your interest for travel and aviation. I think our listeners are really going to enjoy this. I wanted to go with you out to the tropical Pacific. I know you spent some time up by Guam. It looks like you were working with Air Micronesia in Guam in 1998. I mean, what did you learn about life in the tropical Pacific? What was it like to live out there and spend time out there? And what are some of the challenges and opportunities for folks out there?
Well, it's very hot and it's very humid. If you like Galveston right now, you're going to love Guam all year round. But the thing that's it's a different atmosphere, different climate, different attitude, shall we even say? But the things that you still look for in aviation are still the same. You're always checking weather. You're looking at where's your temperature dew point spread, where are the thunderstorms building. We were just talking about super typhoons, that come through there. All that warm Pacific moisture can really generate some massive, massive storms that sometimes we, have to fly around 1,000 miles to get around the things. Of course, when you had to add that range, you're taking off payload, you're keeping passengers at the gate, you're keeping cargo off, So those are some of the things you got to consider when you're flying out there. The other thing is humidity. Humidity plays a huge factor in aircraft performance as well. So the heat and humidity can affect our takeoff and landing performance, as well as our climb performance and our altitude performance.
Does humidity just give you like a denser air, kind of like we were talking about in the beginning?
Yeah, it does, but it gives you more density, which gives you a little bit more lift, a little bit more power. But you're also dealing with the heat, and then you put the two together, the heat and that humid weather. Man, pop-up storms can happen anytime in a matter of minutes. And the vertical development, the thing I noticed about the Pacific, which is really interesting, the vertical development of clouds, of thunderstorms, is much more rapid than it is in the United States here. It's just unbelievable how these clouds just go from little puffy cumuluses to these great towering monsters in a matter of minutes. And you got to keep your eye on that, because if one hits over the airfield, you have some decisions to make.
It sounds like for you as a pilot, you need to be observant, but also flexible to make some changes in that environment, right?
Yeah, extremely. And that's the whole thing. We have a flight plan, and it's agreed to by our dispatchers, our weather folks, and the company and everything. Well, thousands of people. But, you have to be fluid, and you have to anticipate what could go wrong, what could happen with the weather. Case in point, coming into Houston here from South America, we fly all night. And the forecasts are, going to be good for landing into Houston. But I'm flying over Galveston here, and I'm seeing nothing but fog at 4 o'clock in the morning. And so it's like, okay, guys, we might have some other issues we need to take care of coming into Intercontinental. Maybe we need to do an auto landing, instead of a regular visual approach. Or sometimes the thunderstorms come off the coast and hit that. Okay, well, now that closes up our arrival gates. So now we have to go to a different arrival area. So instead of coming in over Galveston, we might have to go over Palacios or go to New Orleans or actually circle back around over towards Dallas and come back in. So all those plans, that are finely tuned can go right out the window if a thunderstorm or some bad weather all of a sudden shows up.
Hey, so Jonathan, you were talking about being out in Guam, Micronesia, the late 90s, around 98. And then it looks like 99, you came back stateside. You were based out of Newark, New Jersey, one of the main airports for Metro New York City. That was just 2 years before 9/11. And you had a lot of experience flying into Metro New York then. If you don't mind me asking, I'm just curious, where were you during 9/11? I mean, and then how did that impact you? How did that horrific day impact you personally and also professionally, you and your colleagues?
Well, it's a day that is it's a black day for us in the aviation industry. And we lost 2 aircraft, Flight 93 and 175, from that day. One of them went into the towers. The Boing 767 went into the towers, and the other one landed in the field in Pennsylvania. And I actually was at home when that happened. I was on my way to the Reno Air Races. I was going to crew for an airplane out there called Miss America, P-51. And when 9/11 hit, all that ground to a halt. Our biggest concern was what's going to happen next. We had these incidents here where there are other aircraft that were going to be used as flying bombs to hit our government or hit our homeland. So the FAA and everybody reacted very quickly in grounding everything immediately. Our dispatch at United, well, it was Continental at the time, sent out coded words immediately to drop the airplanes wherever you're at right now, just get them on the ground. And so that, I think, probably saved a number of aircraft, air crew, and passengers, was that fast reaction by the FAA, the federal government, and the airlines to halt all flights right where we are. Now, we had passengers stuck in Newfoundland. We had passengers stuck in Iceland. We had passengers stuck all over the world. But the bottom line is we got everybody on the ground safely. So that's the hard part about that. There's plaques at our training center that recognize the 2 aircraft that went down, and everybody's name, all the passengers, flight crew, flight attendants, their names are emblazoned on that plaque. And every time you go into training, you see that, and it gets you. It
was such a horrific, tragic day just for every citizen. And then I can't even imagine, being a pilot working in the aviation industry. They were a point of attack, and then a huge impact on the industry for months and even years after that, right? With there was a period where people were afraid to fly. I know economically it hurt the airlines as well.
Yeah, a lot of us got furloughed due to the cutbacks because of that. Nobody's flying, so you still have to keep the airline in business. So many pilots, flight attendants, ground crew got furloughed. And then we're out of jobs for years till the airline the air travel picked back up again. So yeah, it was a huge economic as well as an emotional impact.
Sure.
On us.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. I know it's still such a tragic day. I was talking to my kids about it recently, and it's just hard. It seems like it just happened yesterday, and it's just such a black, dark, terrible day.
Yeah, and I think we need to remember it. I think one thing that's happened, and positive thing that has happened out of it, is that our procedures for hijacking have changed. Extreme measures have come into play. We used to be very passive about it and try to talk down the hijacker and settle them down. And now we're extremely aggressive and taking care of the situation so it doesn't develop.
Sure, that makes perfect sense considering what happened. And I'm amazed at how the aviation industry is flexible and pivots and makes quick changes when they need to. Which they've definitely done in this case.
Yeah, and it's been that way since World War II. Since the Depression, since World War II, the airline has always been able to adapt, and that's kind of the beauty of this business. Is that some fail, most succeed, but being able to adapt to the situation and to the world events. It makes it part of the excitement, part of the challenge of this.
It's true. It's always changing and very dynamic, I would say,
Yeah.
from what I've heard. Jonathan, I think our listeners are going to be excited to continue traveling the world with you. We were talking about your time out in Guam, out in the Intermountain West. And then since 2003, you've been transferred to wide body international routes.
Right.
You're currently a Boeing 777 captain.
Yep.
And you were telling me about all these exotic, crazy places you've gone to. I mean, let's start far north with the Arctic. A lot of times these transatlantic and trans-Pacific and probably seen all kinds of things in the high latitudes. Like, what are some of the things you've seen flying through polar and Arctic regions?
Yeah, one of the craziest things during the daytime, you take off out of Germany in the afternoon, and you've got a 7-8 hour flight, and the sun never sets, and you land here at 8 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and the sun is chasing you the whole way. And you never see the sun set as you're in that polar area. So that's kind of neat. It might dip a little bit towards the horizon, but then it'll come back up. Seeing a sunrise out of the west, that's crazy. You take off and the sun goes down, and then you climb up the altitude and you see the sun actually rise again in the west. That kind of messes with your mind a little bit. Polar ice cap. Oh my goodness. I don't want to swerve into this about, the shrinking of the ice cap, because you really can't tell at this altitude. It's just no way to measure that. But the ice is so thick in Greenland that these 15,000 foot mountains, only the top peaks of them are showing. And the rest of it is just buried in glacial ice. And it's just fascinating to see. They look like little hills like the Appalachians, but they're 15,000 feet down below the surface, and it's nothing but ice.
So there have to be like thousands and thousands of feet of ice, you're saying, in Greenland there.
Yeah, and it's just, you can see, and as the glaciers move and they start calving, and the icebergs start breaking up. First time I went across the Atlantic, we're flying south of Greenland just a little bit. I'm going, wow, look at that regatta. Look at all those sailboats out there. What's up with that? And it was just nothing but icebergs, thousands of icebergs, but it looked like a sailboat regatta.
Well, I've seen they can really kind of splinter and scatter, and all of a sudden I've seen pictures where you could see thousands of miniature icebergs, right?
Right, and they look like sailboats. They look like my little 25-foot Catalina on Offutt's Bayou. But it's an iceberg. It's really, really kind of fascinating to see, and then see the current take them, see where the current will take them. So they're marching along.
Amazing.
Yeah, so it looks like a sailboat regatta. It's kind of cool. The other thing is, the Northern Lights. The Northern Lights are just absolutely spectacular up there. The weather is so clear, and that's looking into the Milky Way and looking into the galaxies with no pollution, no atmospheric distortion. It's just absolutely awe-inspiring to see how many billions, as Carl Sagan would say, billions and billions of stars there are out there. It's absolutely, truly phenomenal to see all that, just soul-stirring.
I mean, and that just must be amazing. Seeing something like the Northern Lights, you're above a lot of the pollutants and a lot of the moisture in the atmosphere, right? So you're getting a really clear view of these things.
Yeah, for sure. And then they go from one corner of the horizon to the other and just light up the whole sky. So that's fascinating.
A lot of times the aurora gets more active when we have like a geomagnetic storm, like that extra solar energy coming in, and I've heard that can impact communications. Have you ever seen the impact of a geomagnetic storm on your communication?
For sure. We now we have satellite communication, to controller communication, so it's not quite as bad. But just up until a few years ago, we were depending on HF radio. And HF is very, very susceptible to electromagnetic activity, solar storms, all things like that. So you're trying to get air traffic control on the old HF radio, and you're dialing up the frequencies, and all you're hearing is static and noise and background noise and high-pitched squeals and nothing doing. So
wow.
Yeah, it does affect us.
It sounds like the technology has improved. Going through satellites reduces a lot of that, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And it's actually helped us with navigation. Obviously, satellite navigation has allowed us to fly straighter routes, be on course more often, save gas, and it's a safety issue as well. So as you're crossing the Atlantic, you'll see airplanes at night just lined up one on top of each other for miles and miles and miles, and it just looks like coming down I-45, but you're over the over the North Atlantic there.
Wow, that's wild. I know. So a lot of times planes will kind of follow each other, right? Just they'll kind of know then what's going on up ahead, and just that's the quickest route too, right?
Right, and so we're assigned navigational tracks, what are called the North Atlantic tracks, and we're assigned a specific route with specific latitude and longitudes at a specific time that we must hit, and that's what keeps us all separated. So we're at different altitudes, but we're on these nat tracks, and so you can look around and there might be a guy, 10, 15 miles ahead of you. He's on the same track. I'm not following him. I'm following what my GPS is saying, what my satellites are telling me where I'm at, because he could be off, so I don't want to
so you're just following your itinerary.
I'm just following what the autopilot and all the computers are telling me. And again, it comes back to systems monitoring on these big jets. The piloting is the takeoff and landing, and that's the fun stuff. But the rest of the time, I'm a systems monitor. And I'm making sure the autopilot, the flight computers, all the controllers are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And if not, that's when we take corrective action.
Sure. I see. That's a good way to put it. It sounds like there are different phases. There's the takeoff, and then there's this long stretch where you're monitoring systems, and then there's a landing, more or less.
Right. So usually for us, it depends on the weather and how dense, how much air traffic is around us. But sometimes we'll fly the airplane all the way up to 18,000 feet or all the way up to our cruising altitude, then turn the autopilot on. On the descent, sometimes we'll do the same thing. Top of descent, we'll turn it off and we'll hand fly it down. If the weather's beautiful and there's not much traffic around, yeah, that's great. Okay. But coming out of London Heathrow, where they expect you to fly a certain path at a certain speed, autopilot comes on at 200 feet. And
that's fascinating.
Yeah, and sometimes the autopilot doesn't come off until you're at the gate. You turn off the runway. So
it sounds like you're saying there are some locations that are more regimented and they want that autopilot engaged like almost immediately.
Yeah, especially Europe. The amount of air traffic that is in the skies right now is just look at FlightAware. Just look at that app and see how many jets are in the sky at one time, and they're all trying to come into one little area.
Yeah. It gets crowded.
Here. Yeah, it gets crowded. So some places like, even Houston can be extremely crowded during its high peak times, 3, 4, 5 o'clock or 7 to 9 o'clock in the morning. It's extremely busy. London Heathrow, there's certain noise abatement procedures that you have to follow. So it's much more difficult to do it by hand. Turn on the autopilot. It knows where to go. It knows how to fly that. So it's just for safety, and it reduces the workload for your co-pilots and your other crew members. Now we're all monitoring the systems. They're not looking for me to make a mistake and mess it up. We're making sure the autopilot doesn't mess it up. And the odds of that are, me making a mistake are much greater than the autopilot doing it. If you program it right.
that really helps our listeners, I think, understand how everything works up there. Hey, Jonathan, I want to ask you, I lived in Alaska for several years. I worked at the Geophysical Institute, and we had the Alaska Volcano Observatory there. They used to educate the public, and they often told us volcanoes and airplanes don't mix. What's the concern of an airplane flying into volcanic ash? And then what would happen? And then how have volcanoes, either coming from Iceland or in the Pacific or wherever, how have erupting volcanoes impacted your routes in your career?
Well, I think it was 2010, the Iceland volcano, I can't pronounce this, whatever, that thing blew up and it shut down the North Atlantic tracks altogether. And for about a week and a half to 2 weeks, everything was stopped. Everything was grounded because you can't fly airplanes into volcanic ash. Essentially what it does, that ash is like a fine grit sandpaper. It's like 125 or 220 sandpaper that's going through your engine, and it's going through your wings, and it's going through the pedostatic system that runs the flight instruments, that runs your computers, and it starts eating away at them. And it starts just dissolving your engines. And so it's a very, very bad thing to happen. So I forget what it was, but British Airways, they called it the Jakarta Kite because they lost all 4 engines on a 747 due to volcanic ash. They inadvertently flew into volcanic ash. All 4 engines shut down on a 747, and they essentially became a glider. They were able to get the thing out of the volcanic ash, headed downhill towards Jakarta. They were able to get 3 of the 4 engines fired up again and land safely. But for, I forget how many miles it was, for quite a long distance, they were on emergency power, no engines, and just a 400 passenger glider heading down towards the Earth. So that's how serious it is.
So this can shut down the engines quickly.
Yes, it can. And we were just actually, my last simulator training was just inadvertent flight into volcanic ash. And the simulators are programmed to show what happens. And the engine temperatures go up, the engines start backfiring, for lack of a better term right now. You start losing power. All your flight instruments go wonky on you. You can't rely on them because the data that's coming from the air is wrong. It's clogged up with sand and ash. So it's a very, very serious situation. And the resolution to that is get out of it as fast as you possibly can.
It sounds like the aviation industry doesn't take any chances, and they'll just like block off any areas that possibly could be impacted by that ash cloud.
Yeah, and as you know, there's active volcanoes in Central America, and so every time we go out, we get a briefing from our weather and dispatchers as what planned volcanic activity is out there, what is anticipated, what could we do, where it could affect due to winds aloft, high winds aloft, and then we make our flight plans accordingly. So if there's any hint of this volcano going off and reaching our altitude or anywhere along our route, we're going to find an alternate route to go around it. Even if it means more time, more gas, safety is paramount.
A friend of mine got stuck. It was taking a winter vacation, I think, to Costa Rica, and then there was a volcano thing. And I'm like, I'm not going to feel bad for you getting stuck in the tropics for an extra week in January. It's like, how did you know this was going to happen?
Right. And the thing is, even if you get the airplane on the ground and everything's fine, everybody's great, the airplane will not be able to fly again. They can't fix that airplane. It's pretty much done.
Wow, so you like totaled an airplane if you fly it into an ash cloud.
If you fly into an ash cloud that's deep enough, yes, you're going to have to replace all 4 engines. You're going to have to replace all the pitot-static systems. You're going to have to replace all the air systems, the hydraulics, the fuel. Yeah, it's a huge deal. So it's not just like taking it to the Jiffy Lube and say, hey, fill it up with oil again. This
is a big deal. I think when I was in Alaska, they talked about ash actually has like very sharp crystals and different things like this, and it can be viscous, it can be heavy. I mean, it'll just really do a number, like you said, on all the systems of an airplane.
Yeah, it can actually, when it gets into the jet engines, it actually turns into molten lava. And so that is getting chunked through your engine and spit out the back. It can flame your engines out. It's not bad. It's like pouring lava into your blender.
It's a really interesting geography lesson too. When the Iceland volcanoes were blowing, I heard a lot of people say, well, I'm not going to Iceland. I'm just going from London to New York. And they didn't realize, you fly really far north there in the Atlantic and close enough that it affects all those Europe to North America routes.
Oh, for sure. And of course, the winds aloft, as you know, they don't just go straight, and they don't stay above Iceland. They go, laterally, they go horizontally, they come down to the lower latitudes, they go up to the higher latitudes, they go longitude out to the west. So, that ash is being, distributed by the upper winds. So
yeah, for sure. And it can go a long way.
It can go a real long way. If you remember what happened to Mount St. Helens, and when that blew, I mean, it shut down the airspace. I was in Cheyenne at the time, and it shut down our airspace.
Volcanic ash. I know this summer we've been talking a lot about smoke from the Canadian wildfires coming into the States. I think people get surprised sometimes how far these aerosols can travel.
Yeah, for sure. And, they're light and the winds are strong. I mean, you remember what happened with the polar vortex this past winter, how much cold air that brought down to us here. That thing is up there spinning, all the time. It's swinging around all the time. The intertropical convergence zone, the horse latitudes, all that stuff. It's
a lot of complex stuff going on out there, right?
A lot of complex stuff up there. Yeah, it's just fascinating to work with.
Hey, Jonathan, so we've been talking about volcanic ash. You could almost think of it as a natural pollutant, if you will. What about like quote unquote man-made pollutants, right? So you get to some of these big cities, maybe in different parts of the world where there's a lot of maybe less environmental regulation. I mean, where have you seen some major man-made pollution? And then are there impacts of that on aviation?
Yeah. Obviously, the mountainous areas and the third world countries or even second world countries, like you said, that don't have the environmental regulations, those impact us the worst. In terms of visibility, it's almost as bad as shooting an instrument approach right down to your minimum 200 feet, half a mile visibility. There was one time in in Delhi, India, where the fog was the pollution was so thick, the carbon dioxide, we actually had to do an auto land as if it were a 0-0 fog landing. And so, yeah, it's bad. Bogota was bad. Mexico City was bad because it's all in that bowl, and all
Surrounded
that
by
pollution.
mountains, right?
Yeah, and it just has nowhere to go. And sometimes, unfortunately, even coming into Houston here, when we have temperature inversions, you'll see that sulfuric cloud kind of make it show up as you're coming up from South America during the dawn, and you'll see this orange cloud due to the temperature inversion, and you'll see the pollutants below 10,000 feet, and it's just definitely a real line of demarcation. And then it's clear above, but right there you see that orange sulfuric type cloud as we come into
So
Houston.
I'd imagine you're seeing more man-made or industrial pollution when you have high pressure, light winds, right? You're not getting strong winds mixing things up. Is that generally true?
Yeah, that's generally true. Or like like we said, in the springtime or wintertime, beginning of that area when we have the temperature inversions. Yeah, low winds and stuff like that. Yeah, that's when you really see it. But it's surprising because you think Houston, okay, we got the manufacturing here, the petrochemical industry, which is is so important for our economy. But sometimes you just look at that and you go, wow, this is not Tokyo. this is us. So
Yeah,
I'm grateful for the sea breeze that can blow that out.
That's
that
right.
out a little bit. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The other thing that's really interesting too is the rice fields. When they start burning the rice fields here, and all that smoke and haze comes into us, that can reduce our visibilities. Again, similar to fog, and you mix that with maybe a fog event, and then things slow down at the airport.
Oh, so there can even be like an agricultural pollution, even
Yeah.
I would imagine maybe burning sugarcane, things like that.
Yep.
Anything that you're burning crops or burning vegetation.
Yep. That all takes a huge effect on it as well.
Jonathan, you not only have experience with aviation. Before we close out here, I know you're very experienced and talented as an artist as well. I mean, so you've been doing art, I would imagine, for a long time. I've seen some of your paintings are gorgeous. How did you get interested in art? And then before we started recording today, you were talking about potentially a gap that not a lot of people have written about extreme weather impacting art.
Yeah. I started drawing airplanes when I was a little kid in school. I was the kid in the back of the classroom making airplane noises and Messerschmitts shooting down B-17s and P-51s and Sopwith Camels and all that stuff. So that's how that all started, and it just developed, throughout the course of my life. I was on reserve or standby with Rocky Mountain, and I was just spinning my wheels, and my wife said, "You're boring me to death. You need something to do." And she got me the big Bob Ross hair starter kit. And I thought, oh, okay, I'll try this. And one thing led to another. And now it's just, been very fortunate with the art as a sideline career as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. No, I've seen some of your work is beautiful. It seems like you paint a lot of maritime and natural landscapes, right? I mean, you tend to a lot of nature and environmental and just kind of outdoors.
It's fascinating. A lot of the great painters, outdoor painters from the 1600s all the way up, you look at like the Hudson River School painters who painted the America West back in the 1800s. They always had some sort of dramatic weather depicted in their paintings. So you see the Rocky Mountains or the Front Range or Yosemite, and there's this big, massive thunderstorm or a beautiful sunset or the red, the clouds, being illuminated by the sun, or a moonrise over the ocean or something like that. So the weather is really an important part of painting. That it's not just a painting of a subject or a boat or a flower or something like that. The real great masters were able to incorporate weather into composition, how the painting looks, where your eye moves throughout the painting, and make that attractive or terrifying, with storms and sea waves and thunderstorms and things like that. Make it terrifying. but it's all there to invoke an emotional response. And weather is the best and the easiest way, toughest to paint, but the best way to set a mood for a painting.
It sure does. And it kind of takes you there. It gives you more of a sense of what that place is like, right?
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
And
so
Jonathan,
that's the
really,
challenge.
Art is really a side job for you as well, right? I mean, as a side career, how can people find you if people wanted to look at your paintings or maybe reach out to you?
The website is CUAA or Charlie Uniform Alpha Alpha art, ART.com. CUAA-art. And it was originally Ceilings Unlimited aeromotive art because I was doing cars and airplanes, but now it's branched out into other things as well.
No, for sure. You're a very diverse and well-rounded guy. I'd encourage our listeners to check out your art. I think they'll be really impressed.
Yeah.
And thank you, Jonathan, for coming on the podcast and just sharing an insider's view of what it's like to work in the aviation industry, some of the exotic and amazing sights you've seen, and what it's like to travel and fly in different parts of the world.
Yeah, it's been a blessing, and it's been a wonderful few minutes with you, and wish you all the best. Thanks again, Hal. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate you taking time to come on the podcast.
My bet. Take care.
Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing those insightful and adventurous perspectives as we traveled the world with you. What an adventure it was, and a really fun podcast here. I really got 3 take-home messages from this podcast. The number one thing that I really got was the extent to which extreme weather impacts aviation. Whether it's these towering thunderstorms that almost instantaneously pop up over the tropical Pacific, thin air over the Rocky Mountains, or some of these impacts in the Arctic and other places in the far north or far south. Really, the impact of extreme weather on aviation is so extensive. It seems like it's everywhere. Pilots in the aviation industry need to monitor that, be aware of these processes. And what I got too was that they have to be very flexible to sometimes change their plans in an instant. Really interesting there about that relationship between weather and aviation. The second thing I really got from this podcast is the value of visualization. So in climate science, one of the big concerns right now are the melting of the ice sheets in places like Antarctica and Greenland. We can hear scientists talk about their models and look at graphs and charts and analysis, but to hear Jonathan talk about flying over Greenland, and there are these towering mountains where you just see the peak sticking out of the ice sheet, it really gives you a different perspective of how much ice is out there on the planet. As that melts, you get the idea of sea level rise and other impacts that could affect millions of people around the world. I never quite heard of that perspective from 35,000 feet of flying over Greenland, and it really gave me a different angle. I think it gives all of us a different perspective on how much ice is out there, and also the value of surveying the world from above, whether it's satellites, airplanes, or flying over these places at a high elevation and all the things that you could see. Thank you so much for sharing those perspectives with us. The final thing, really the final take-home point that I really got from this is the wide-reaching, just how much natural disasters and extreme weather can affect people, millions of people, billions of people around the world, and the far-reaching impacts of that. We talked about how volcanoes in Iceland can shut down aviation and air traffic from Europe to North America. You might have someone flying from New York to London and saying, hang on a second, I'm not going to Iceland, but that far north route over the North Atlantic, all of a sudden they're impacted by volcanoes in Iceland, even though Iceland was never on their itinerary. It just reminds us the far-reaching impacts of extreme weather and natural disasters on all of us, especially if we're traveling long distances. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your insights. Thanks as well to our listeners for making us the #1 podcast on the topic of natural disasters, according to FeedSpot. It's been your listenership, your support, and also sharing this content with others, liking it on social media. We love to bring you experts, adventurers, explorers, scientists, people that have really seen extreme weather and natural disasters from different angles, even if it's from 35,000 feet of altitude. Thanks as well to our marketing and development team over there in Mobile, Alabama, for editing this content and disseminating out. We have a great team that works together for every podcast episode. So it's not just me. There's a lot of folks behind the scenes as well. Everyone, thanks so much for tuning in. Always a joy to come with you and explore the world on the GeoTrek podcast. We'll catch you on the next episode of the GeoTrek podcast.